order conditioning, think of higher order conditioning is a second step of conditioning after you initially condition the animal. In the case of Pavlov's dogs, we had the metronome, which is a neutral stimulus one, paired with the unconditioned stimulus, which caused the unconditioned response. Okay. Then we repeatedly pair neutral stimulus one with the food unconditioned stimulus, and the response is salivation. Okay. Then we take away the unconditioned stimulus and just present the metronome. What does that do? Because it was paired with the unconditioned stimulus, it causes now a conditioned response. So we have the metronome, now the dog salivate. In higher order conditioning, now we're going to add an additional neutral stimulus. In this case, it is a light. So we add the light with the metronome, okay? And when we add the light with the metronome, the dogs salivate because they are already salivating to the metronome because we have created the connection with the food. So now we're creating the connection with the light. So we present the light and the metronome simultaneously, and the dogs will salivate. Then if we present the light by itself, because now the conditioned stimulus is acting like the unconditioned stimulus in higher order conditioning, the light alone will make the dog salivate. So in higher order conditioning, the neutral, you introduce a neutral stimulus with a conditioned stimulus that has already been conditioned to cause a conditioned response. So we have a neutral stimulus number 2, which is our light, and now we pair it with the conditioned stimulus number 1 that's already been associated with the food that causes salivation. We pair those simultaneously. So the conditioned stimulus 1 acts like an unconditioned stimulus. And then we take away that conditioned stimulus number 1 and show the light, and the dog will respond just like it did before with the previous conditioned stimulus. So we create a second conditioned stimulus that causes a conditioned response. Okay. Sensory preconditioning. Now, sensory preconditioning is when one stimulus is conditioned as a conditioned stimulus number 1, okay? And another previously paired stimulus can also become a conditioned stimulus. So in this example, we have 2 neutral stimuli. We have a tool shed and wasp, okay? And because wasps sting, we associate fear with the stinging wasp, okay? So wasps are associated with fear. Because the wasp is in the tool shed, they are happening simultaneously. So we have 2 neutral stimuluses happening simultaneously, okay? However, the wasp is associated with the sting and therefore causes the fear. So the first neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus number 1. The wasp becomes the first conditioned stimulus, which elicits the first conditioned response, fear. Because it was associated with the wasp, the tool shed becomes the second conditioned stimulus, okay? Because they are together. And as a result, the tool shed now is associated with fear as well. So sensory preconditioning is more effective when the 2 are simultaneously presented together. So when the 2 stimuli are simultaneously presented together. In this case, we went to the tool shed, and the tool shed, we were in the tool shed, and there's wasp in the tool shed. So we got stung, we got the stung of the wasp, which makes us afraid of wasp, and we are afraid of the tool shed because the tool shed was with the wasp, okay? That's what sensory preconditioning is about, okay? The key point is there's 2 neutral stimulus that are paired together. 2 neutral stimulus that are paired together for preconditioning. So here's an example of our metronome and light with preconditioning. Two neutral stimulus are paired simultaneously. Light, metronome, light, metronome, light, metronome, simultaneously with the dog. Then the metronome is paired with the food. The dog salivates. Then the metronome is paired by itself. The dog salivates. And then if we introduce the other neutral stimulus that was paired with the metronome, which was the light, the dogs will salivate. So that means two neutral stimulus that were presented at the same time, even though only one of the neutral stimulus was paired with an unconditioned stimulus, both still will elicit the conditioned response because those two neutral stimulus were paired exactly at the same time. Okay, prior to presenting the unconditioned stimulus, prior to what we call acquisition. Okay, then we have now we're going to talk about what we're going to focus on, the unconditioned stimulus. We've been focusing on neutral stimuli. Now we're going to focus on unconditioned stimulus, which is unconditioned stimulus revaluation. Okay, now the conditioning paradigm is dependent on what the unconditioned stimulus does to cause the response, the unconditioned response or the conditioned response. So we have a metronome, but we have different amounts of unconditioned stimuli, different amounts of food. So the intensity of the unconditioned stimulus is now going to determine whether the conditioned response happens or how strong the conditioned response is. So the metronome is the neutral stimulus, and the unconditioned stimulus in the first acquisition is a small amount of food. And because it's just a small amount of food, then we have a weak amount of salivation. So if we have a small amount of food of our unconditioned stimulus, then when we condition the metronome, when we present the metronome without the unconditioned stimulus, the small amount of food, then we'll have a weak salivation based upon the amount or in kind of the intensity of the level or the amount or the value or of the unconditioned stimulus. In the second, if we have a large amount of food, this is still the unconditioned stimulus we're talking about, and we pair that with the metronome, which is a neutral stimulus, then we'll see a stronger salivation because of the larger amount of food that we presented with the metronome. So the intensity or the value or the amount of the unconditional stimulus will determine how the response will be. Small, low intensity, low, small response. High, large amount, high response. So this paradigm is focusing on the unconditioned stimulus, which the other ones focused on the neutral stimulus. Now we focused on the unconditioned stimulus. Okay. Now we have four examples of classical conditioning that are related to higher order conditioning, but it depends on if we're focusing on neutral stimuli and or conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. As I said in class, we have overshadowing and blocking. And overshadowing and blocking are considered compound stimulus because they consist of simultaneously presenting two or more individual stimuli versus the other two examples. So let's get into this. Overshadowing. Overshadowing sounds just like it sounds. One neutral stimulus is going to overshadow another after conditioning happens. So we have the light and the metronome that are presented at the same time as we present food when we're trying to condition the animal and the animal salivates. Then we multiply do that: light and food, light metronome, food, light metronome, food, light metronome, food, light metronome, food. Then we just present the light metronome. And of course, the dog has associated the light metronome with the presentation of food, so the dog salivates. Then we're going to separate the two neutral stimuli that we condition. And lo and behold, the first stimuli that is presented in the pairing is the only one that's going to elicit the response because it's overshadowing It's overcoming the second conditioned stimulus or the second neutral stimulus. Because remember, the neutral stimuli become the conditioned stimuli. Okay. So in this case, because the light was presented before the metronome and the with the food, and then the light and metronome both elicited when they're presented at the same time, elicits the response of salivation. However, when we separate the two, only the first one in the presentation will elicit the response in the organism. Okay, so in this case, the light will only make salivation and not the metronome, because the light is overshadowing, is casting a shadow upon the metronome, which is blocking it from being recognized as something that the dog should salivate to. Then we have blocking. Okay, and blocking sounds just like it sounds. Overshadowing, the dog still learns to salivate with both of them, but when they're presented separately, the first one overcomes the second one. But if we go back and present them together, the dog will salivate. When we separate them, the first one overshadows the second one. In blocking, we have we first take a neutral stimulus and pair it with an unconditioned stimulus. So in this case, we pair the light with the food and the dog salivate. The light with the food, the dog salivates. Then we show the light by itself and the dog salivates. Then we start a higher order conditioning with blocking. So now we're going to present the light with the metronome with the food. Light, metronome, food, light, metronome, food, light, metronome, food, dog salivate. Then we present the light alone and the dog will salivate. Okay. Then we present the metronome and the dog doesn't salivate at all. The dog does nothing because the light has completely blocked the association that occurred simultaneously when they were together. Uh, Light, metronome, food, dog salivating. Now the light by itself, we present the light by itself, the dog salivate. But if we present the metronome by itself, it completely blocks, the dog makes no connection of it, and there's no salivation. Okay. So the key is there's several pairings of the compound stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So the compound is two or more stimuli. Okay. Then we have only the light presented by itself repeatedly. Okay. Um, and the dog will salivate. Then we present the metronome, and the dog won't salivate because the presence of the light blocked the conditioning to the metronome. Okay. So the presence of the light blocked the conditioning to the metronome. Okay. It's similar to overshadowing, except the compound consists of neutral stimulus and a conditioned stimulus rather than two neutral stimuli. Okay. So we started off with two neutral stimuli in overshadowing. And then in blocking, we have a conditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus. That's the difference. It's the same outcome, but how we got there is two neutral stimulus in overshadowing and conditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus in blocking. Okay. Occasional setting is a procedure in which the stimulus on the occasion signals whether the conditioned stimulus is likely to be followed by the unconditioned stimulus and controls whether or not the conditioned stimulus will elicit the conditioned response. It signals either the presentation or absence of the unconditioned stimulus or the intensity of it. Okay. The occasional setting is an important factor in many instances of classical conditioning. So here we have, and this is on um, page 157 in your book. Okay. And they gave it examples of the alcoholic parents and mild abuse and severe abuse. Okay. So when we talk about um, this, we talk about occasional signals, either the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, okay, uh, or the absence, or even the change of the intensity of the unconditioned stimulus. So imagine that an abused child receives his worst beatings from his parents whenever they are drinking alcohol. Okay, thus, alcohol absent parents and mild abuse causes mild anxiety. Alcohol present parents is severe abuse and causes strong anxiety. And although the child typically feels a mild amount of anxiety around his parents, the sight or the smell of the occasion of alcohol in the presence of his parents greatly increases his anxiety. Okay, so the smell of the alcohol is kind of that setting, that trigger. So alcohol absent parents cause mild anxiety, and alcohol parents cause strong anxiety because they're smelling it. So the conditioned response of anxiety is the condition response of anxiety to the parents is intensified by the presence of alcohol. Okay. So alcohol becomes the occasion setter. All right. So it alters the child's level of anxiety in the presence of their parents. So a setting is something that is presented in conjunction to um, that condition stimulus. Okay, in this case, it's the smell of the alcohol. Okay, it could be the if the parent was an alcoholic and was an abuser, it could be the smell of the parent's perfume. Okay, like if it was the mother was the abuser, it would be the smell of the mother perfume. Whether and the stronger the perfume, the more the setting, the more likelihood that your anxiety would be. Okay, so that's a little bit more of an explanation that I did in class. Okay, hopefully you'll watch it. So latent inhibition, this is the last of the inhibitions, and this is on page 158. This is the more familiar that the organism, the animal, the person is to the neutral stimulus. If they have some experience with a neutral stimulus, then it's going to be very difficult to condition that neutral stimulus because they have familiarity with it. So they won't be able to make the association between you presenting the unconditioned stimulus with that neutral stimulus, because the neutral stimulus is kind of habitual. It's kind of a habit to them. So in the case of the Pavlov's dogs, if they've heard the metronome being presented over and over and over and over again, and then you try to pair it with food, they won't make the association between the food and the metronome because they're so familiar with the metronome. So latent inhibition prevents the development of conditioned responses. Okay, the redundancy or the repeatedness of the neutral stimulus, when it's coincidentally paired with an unconditioned stimulus, will prevent the animal from being conditioned to it when it's presented alone. Okay, so I hope that helps you and clears things up. This is going to be a short recording, so you can go back and listen to it, especially kind of my more thorough example of occasional setting. And think of occasional setting as some sensory element in one's environment that gives you a trigger that something will occur. Okay.